Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Renew You Students YouTube channel. We are concluding what is our series on the Tale of Two Kings, where we first started with King Saul, how God brought him up, and then his disobedience really destroyed his own kingship and that of his family. Then, with the disobedience of Saul, came King David, or God called for King David, or David to become king. And although he had the heart of God and he followed God in many of the steps throughout his whole lifetime, he still made mistakes, just as King Saul did. But he was repentful for his mistakes and he wanted to do things right. In the last story, we talked about how one of the things that David did was that he had mighty men with him as part of his army who were very courageous and brave, and three of them stood out above the rest because of their loyalty to David, of their courage in comparison. And we encourage you guys to also be courageous, to be brave, and honor our true King, which is in heaven.
And so today we kind of wrap up King David's life with a very different type of a story. So what happened was originally God had told the Israelites to not take a census. And a census is just basically you count up the number of people that you have. And specifically, God had asked them not to count the numbers of their fighting men, so the people that would go out into battle with the king. And the purpose of this order was God didn't want them relying on, the strength of their own numbers, because God was supposed to be their true king, and he wanted them relying on him and not necessarily how many people that they had with them. Because if you go into battle with 10 people, you might not think that you're going to be able to do much. But if you go in with 100,000 people, you're probably going to be able to win the battle very easily. But God wanted them to rely on his strength and not the strength of if they're going into battle with 10 or 100,000 different people. And so this was something that King David was not supposed to do. And scripture says that God got angry with the people of Israel and kind of inspired David to go and do this. Now, David had a choice here of following what he should and should not do. But he chose to go ahead and try to number the fighting men. So he goes and tells his general, Joab, who we've talked about, that he was going to do this. And Joab looks at him and is like, are you sure that you want to do this? Because Joab knew the order from God as well. Everybody did. And David was like, no, we're still going to do this. And so they kind of started numbering up their fighting men. And as they got to the end, David realized that he had sinned, because this was a direct order from God to not do this. And he had done this. And so he got, you know how you feel guilt after you do something you know you're not supposed to do? David had that guilt, and he was like, I've done something absolutely terrible. And so a prophet during this time named Gad comes to David and says, you have sinned, obviously. And so I'm going to give you 3 options for your punishment. And that's kind of a cool thing, because not all of our parents give us options for what our punishment should be. And so here God gives David 3 options. And the options are either David can have 3 months of just running from his enemies while they constantly chase him. He could have 3 days of plague in his land. Or he could have 3 years of famine. And a famine is where there's no food or crops or anything for the people to be able to eat. So it's kind of a 3 rule, either 3 years of famine, 3 months of just running from his enemies, or just 3 days of just straight up plague throughout the entire land. And David said, I would rather not fall into like the hands of humans, because God's mercy is greater than that of humans. So I'd rather fall in the hands of God. So let's have a plague, basically. So for 3 days, there was a drastic plague. 3 days. And finally, God kind of relented and after the 3 days, saying that was enough. I've done what I need to do. And then following this, David does something different that he hasn't done before with his sin. He decides that he's going to follow Gad's advice and go up and build an altar to God and offer a sacrifice. So he goes and talks to this guy he says that he wants to buy this land from him just so he can offer a sacrifice. And the man's looking at him. He's like, you can just have this land. I will give this land to you and you can do whatever you want with it. Mm-hmm. And David says, no, I will not just take this land from you because I want to make sure that I am sacrificing to the Lord. And I don't want to give something to God that costs me nothing. Because David understood that sacrifice was, it has to cost something for actually to be a sacrifice. And that's what a sacrifice is. It has to cost something. And so David pays for the land. He goes up and builds an altar and offers a true sacrifice to God. And God answers his prayer, and the plague is completely stopped.
Yeah, so this is a very nice contrast to what is the life of David and even of Saul. Because in this case, David made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and a mistake that we would make too. And, in previous mistakes that he did, he would receive a punishment from God as part of the consequence of what he had done. But he would still be just trapped in that place of, I'm terrible, I'm a horrible person, to the point that it drives him to inaction, leading to terrible messes in his family and in his kingdom. But in this case, after this terrible plague is going over the land, he actually takes action. And when we have messed up, when we feel down, when we feel like things aren't going right, that is when we can also take action. And that action should be to go to God, to sacrifice what we have, to run towards him, and to really dedicate our lives to God. And that is the biggest thing that David could have done in the middle of everything that Saul didn't really do. So by dedicating your life to God, you are turning a new page in your life. And so this with King David, this whole, not only did it stop the plague, but this place in which he did this altar, this sacrifice, and really looked for God, that was now going to be the place where his son was now going to have a foundation to build the temple for God. So really, it means that when we sacrifice for God, when we look towards him, it just doesn't only affect us, but then now you can be a beacon of light to the people around you. And now you can see that God's blessing and will and power will go even beyond you.
And so that kind of wraps up the story of David. Obviously, he has like some last words and things like that. And then basically he gives power over to his son, Solomon, and then dies after that. And that's kind of the life of King David. And it's very interesting that his life was so different from that of King Saul, and how God had chosen them both to be king. But it ultimately shows that it doesn't matter if God chooses you. You also have to choose God. And you have to continuously follow God and follow after the things that he has for you. And he will bless you in that, as he did with King David and not necessarily with King Saul. And so even though you may mess up, and you are going to mess up, as long as you keep turning back to God, that's the main difference between King Saul and King David. Was David did keep coming back to God no matter how much he had messed up. And it shows to be a great example for us of, no matter what we do, to come back to God, because he will take care of us and he will continue to bless us and provide for us. And so that concludes A Tale of Two Kings, of King Saul and King David. And we'll start a new series next week, and we'll see you then.
See ya.